In the bustling heart of London, where history and modernity intertwined seamlessly, there stood a man named James Callahan. To most people passing by Buckingham Palace, he was just another face in the sea of red uniforms and towering bearskin hats, the iconic royal guards who drew tourists from every corner of the globe. But James wasn't like the others. Beneath his calm exterior lay a story far more extraordinary than anyone could imagine. James had always been a man of few words but immense action. Born into a modest family in Yorkshire, he grew up with dreams bigger than his small town could contain. From an early age, discipline came naturally to him. Whether it was excelling in school or mastering martial arts at the local gym, James approached everything with focus and determination. His quiet confidence often made people underestimate him, but those who knew him well understood that beneath his reserved demeanor lay a reservoir of strength. At 21, James joined the military, driven by a desire to serve something greater than himself. It didn't take long for his superiors to notice his exceptional skills. He quickly rose through the ranks, eventually earning a coveted spot as a Navy SEAL, a title that carried both honor and immense responsibility. Over the next decade, James became part of some of the most dangerous missions around the world, from covert operations in hostile territories to high-stakes rescues under cover of darkness. He faced situations that would make even the bravest hearts tremble. Yet, through it all, James remained unshaken, relying on his training, instincts, and unwavering sense of duty. But after years of living on the edge, James began to feel the weight of his choices. The constant adrenaline, the separation from loved ones, and the toll it took on his body and mind led him to reconsider his path. When his service ended, instead of seeking fame or fortune, James chose a quieter life. He applied to become a royal guard, drawn to the idea of standing watch over tradition and heritage. For him, it wasn't about stepping away from responsibility. It was about finding peace while continuing to protect what mattered. Every day, James donned his uniform with pride. Though his role now seemed simple compared to his past adventures, he approached it with the same level of dedication. Standing perfectly still outside Buckingham Palace, rain or shine, he became a symbol of steadfastness. Tourists would snap pictures, children would giggle, and sometimes couples would argue nearby, all distractions that never once broke his concentration. To James, this wasn't just a job, it was a sacred trust. Each hour spent guarding the palace was a reminder of why he'd chosen this life, to safeguard not only a building but also the values it represented. What no one realized, however, was how much James's past shaped his present. The combat techniques he'd mastered, the split-second decision-making he'd perfected, and the mental resilience he'd developed were all still very much alive within him. They weren't tools he needed daily anymore, but they were always there, lying dormant beneath the surface. James often thought about how strange it was that people saw him as nothing more than a statue-like figure in a red coat. If only they knew the battles he'd fought, the lives he'd saved, and the sacrifices he'd made. But James preferred it that way. He didn't need recognition or applause. All he wanted was to do his duty quietly and honorably. As the days turned into months, James settled into his routine. He found comfort in its predictability, a stark contrast to the chaos of his former life. Still, deep down, he couldn't help but wonder if his unique set of skills would ever be called upon again. Little did he know, fate had other plans. On a crisp autumn afternoon, when the air carried a hint of winter and the streets buzzed with activity, James's quiet world would be disrupted in ways he hadn't anticipated. And when that moment arrived, the true depth of his character would shine through, not just for himself, but for everyone watching. On a crisp autumn afternoon, the usually serene streets surrounding Buckingham Palace buzzed with an unusual energy. The air carried the faint scent of roasted chestnuts from nearby vendors, mingling with the sound of footsteps and chatter from tourists eager to catch a glimpse of British royalty. But amidst this lively atmosphere, something darker began to stir. a disruption that would soon test the patience and resolve of everyone present. The first sign of trouble came in the form of distant rumbling. At first, it was easy to mistake the noise for thunder or construction work. However, as the sound grew louder, heads turned toward the source. A group of bikers roared into view, their motorcycles growling like angry beasts. Their leather jackets gleamed under the pale sunlight, adorned with patches and insignias that hinted at their rebellious nature. They weren't just passing through, they had arrived with intent. Leading the pack was Razor, a burly man whose menacing appearance matched his reputation. With a thick beard, piercing eyes, and arms covered in tattoos, he exuded an aura of intimidation. Razor thrived on chaos, finding joy in disrupting order wherever he went. His gang followed suit, each member more reckless than the last. Together, they were a force to be reckoned with, or so they believed. As they circled the square outside the palace, their engines revved aggressively, drowning out conversations and startling pigeons into flight. Pedestrians scrambled to get out of their way, clutching their bags tightly, as if expecting trouble. Nearby police officers tried to intervene, waving their arms and shouting for the bikers to leave the area. But Razor only laughed, dismissing their warnings with a sneer. "What are you gonna do, huh?" he taunted, his voice dripping with mockery. "We're just having some fun." Their antics quickly escalated. One biker popped a wheelie dangerously close to a family with young children, causing them to stumble backward in fear. Another tossed empty soda cans onto the ground, leaving litter in their wake. Passers-by exchanged nervous glances, unsure whether to confront the bikers or stay safely out of their path. The once peaceful scene had transformed into one of tension and unease. It wasn't long before the gang's attention shifted to the royal guards stationed near the palace gates. To Razor and his crew, these stoic figures seemed like perfect targets for their harassment. After all, what could a bunch of men in red coats and tall hats possibly do against a gang of rowdy bikers? Surely, they wouldn't dare break their rigid protocol to fight back. It was almost too easy. Razor steered his motorcycle closer to the guards, circling them slowly as though sizing them up. His lips curled into a cruel grin when he noticed James standing perfectly still, seemingly unfazed by the commotion around him. To Razor, James's silence felt like arrogance, an invitation to push harder. He leaned forward on his bike, narrowing the gap between them. "Hey, soldier boy," he called out, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "You deaf or something? Can't hear me over your fancy hat?" When James didn't respond, Razor's grin widened. Encouraged by his lack of reaction, the rest of the gang joined in, hurling insults and jeers. "Look at this guy, probably scared stiff," one biker shouted, earning laughter from the others. Another revved his engine loudly right next to James, trying to startle him. Yet, despite the escalating provocation, James remained motionless, his gaze fixed straight ahead, as if nothing existed beyond his line of duty. To the onlookers, the situation felt surreal. Here was a man being openly mocked and harassed, yet he showed no signs of anger or frustration. Some admired his composure, while others whispered among themselves, wondering how much longer he could hold out. Would he eventually snap? Or would he continue to endure the abuse without flinching? For Razor and his gang, the lack of response only fueled their audacity. They began weaving in and out of the crowd, deliberately blocking pathways and creating obstacles. When a tourist accidentally bumped into one of the bikers, the man shoved him roughly, sending him sprawling onto the pavement. Gasps rippled through the crowd, but no one dared step forward to intervene. Fear hung thick in the air, palpable and suffocating. Unbeknownst to the bikers, however, their actions were about to have consequences far greater than they anticipated. While James appeared calm on the surface, every insult, every rev of the engine, and every act of disrespect was registering in his mind. Years of military training had taught him to remain composed under pressure, but even the most disciplined individuals have limits, and as the gang continued their rampage, Oblivious to the storm brewing beneath James's quiet exterior, it became clear that this encounter was far from over. Little did they know, the man they saw as an easy target was anything but ordinary. Hidden behind his unassuming demeanor lay skills and experiences that made him uniquely equipped to handle situations like this. For now, though, James kept his focus steady, waiting for the right moment to act. Because sometimes patience isn't weakness, it's strategy. And Razor's gang was about to learn that lesson the hard way. The tension in the square outside Buckingham Palace was thick enough to cut with a knife. Razor and his gang of bikers were growing bolder by the minute, their taunts escalating as they reveled in the chaos they were creating. James Callahan remained an immovable figure amidst the storm, his posture unwavering despite the relentless provocation. To the onlookers, it seemed almost surreal. How could someone endure such open disrespect without reacting? But inside, James's mind was anything but calm. Each insult hurled at him echoed like a distant drumbeat, steady and deliberate. "What's wrong, soldier boy? Too scared to move?" Razor sneered again, leaning closer on his motorcycle, his voice dripping with mockery. The crowd watched nervously, unsure whether to admire James's discipline or fear for his safety. Some whispered among themselves, speculating about what might happen next. Would he snap? Would he retaliate? Or would he simply stand there until the harassment ended? James wasn't oblivious to the situation unfolding around him. Every rev of the engine, every jeer from the bikers, registered sharply in his mind. Yet years of military training had taught him the value of patience. He knew better than to let emotions dictate his actions. Instead, he focused on maintaining control, his thoughts moving methodically behind his stoic expression. Protocol demanded that he remain still, no matter the circumstances. For now, he adhered to that rule. But inside, something else stirred. Memories began to surface, unbidden yet vivid. Flashes of his time as a Navy SEAL flooded his mind. The adrenaline of high-stakes missions, the precision required to neutralize threats, the split-second decisions that meant life or death. These weren't just distant recollections. They were instincts, deeply ingrained, and always ready to resurface when needed. James's body may have been standing still, but his mind was calculating, analyzing the situation with razor-sharp clarity. Razor, misinterpreting James's silence as weakness, grew bolder. He dismounted his bike and took a few steps closer, his boots clanging against the cobblestones. "You hear me, huh? I said you scared," he repeated, his tone louder and more aggressive this time. When James still didn't respond, Razor smirked and turned to his gang. "This guy's all talk and no action. Probably doesn't even know how to fight." The comment drew laughter from the bikers, but it also sent a ripple through the crowd. A young woman clutching her child whispered to her companion, "He should do something. They're going too far." An older man nearby shook his head, muttering, "They don't realize who they're messing with." But James heard none of it. His focus was singular, his breathing steady, his gaze fixed straight ahead. Then came the moment that pushed things further. One of the bikers, emboldened by Razor's bravado, decided to take matters into his own hands. With a loud laugh, he deliberately knocked over a ceremonial stand near James, sending medals, insignias, and other symbolic items scattering across the ground. The sound of metal clinking against stone broke the tense silence, drawing gasps from the spectators. It was a blatant act of disrespect, not just toward James, but toward the tradition and honor he represented. For James, that was the tipping point. While protocol dictated restraint, there were lines that couldn't be crossed. The scattered medals weren't just objects. They symbolized sacrifice, duty, and the values he had sworn to uphold. Something inside him shifted, a quiet resolve crystallizing into action. Without hesitation, James stepped forward, breaking his rigid stance for the first time since the confrontation began. The movement caught everyone off guard. Razor froze mid-laugh, his smirk faltering as James approached. The crowd collectively held its breath, unsure of what was about to happen. James stopped mere feet away from Razor, his towering frame radiating authority. Though his voice remained calm, there was an unmistakable edge to it. "Pick it up," he said, his words sharp and commanding. Razor blinked, momentarily thrown off balance. He hadn't expected any response, let alone one so direct. Recovering quickly, he scoffed, trying to regain his bravado. "Or what?" he challenged, crossing his arms over his chest. "What are you gonna do, huh?" But James didn't answer. Instead, he stood there, his presence speaking louder than words. The air between them crackled with tension, the kind that comes before a storm breaks. For the first time, Razor felt a flicker of doubt. There was something in James's eyes, something cold, calculated, and utterly unshakable. It wasn't anger or fear, it was confidence, and in that moment, Razor realized he might have underestimated the man in the red coat. The crowd sensed the shift too. The nervous murmurs faded, replaced by an eerie silence, as everyone waited to see what would happen next. Even the bikers seemed less sure of themselves, their earlier bravado wavering under James's unwavering gaze. What had started as a game for them was rapidly becoming something else entirely, a test of wills, with stakes higher than they'd anticipated. James didn't move, didn't flinch. He simply stood there, his command hanging in the air like a challenge. "Pick it up." 3 simple words, yet they carried the weight of authority and purpose. Razor hesitated, his bravado crumbling slightly. For the first time, he wondered if he'd gone too far. But pride is a stubborn thing, and backing down wasn't an option, not in front of his gang, not in front of the crowd. And so, the stage was set. The quiet guardian had spoken, and now it was up to Razor to decide how this encounter would play out. But deep down, both men knew one thing for certain. Whatever happened next would change everything. The air in the square was electric, charged with an intensity that made it hard to breathe. Razor stood frozen for a moment, his bravado wavering under James's unyielding gaze. The comment, "Pick it up," hung in the air like a challenge, simple yet loaded with authority. For a man who thrived on chaos and intimidation, this sudden shift in dynamics felt unfamiliar, even unsettling. But Razor wasn't about to back down, not in front of his gang or the growing crowd of onlookers. "You think you're tough, huh?" Razor finally spat out, his voice laced with defiance. He took a step forward, closing the gap between himself and James. His fists clenched at his sides, and his posture shifted into something more aggressive. "I don't take orders from nobodies in fancy hats." James didn't respond immediately. Instead, he studied Razor with the same calm focus he'd maintained throughout the entire ordeal. There was no fear in his expression, no sign of hesitation. To anyone watching, it almost seemed as though James had stepped into another world, a place where noise and threats faded away, leaving only clarity and purpose. Years of training had taught him how to read people, and right now, he could see exactly what Razor was, a bully trying to mask insecurity with aggression. When James finally spoke, his tone was measured but firm. "You made your choice," he said, his deep voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "Now face the consequences." Razor blinked, caught off guard by the quiet confidence in James's words. This wasn't the reaction he'd expected. Most people would have either cowered or exploded in anger by now. But James was different. His calm demeanor unnerved Razor, planting a seed of doubt in his mind. Still, pride wouldn't let him retreat. With a growl, he swung his fist, aiming for James's jaw in an attempt to assert dominance. What happened next unfolded so quickly that many in the crowd barely registered it. James sidestepped the punch with effortless precision, his movements fluid and controlled. Before Razor could recover, James grabbed his wrist and twisted it gently but firmly, forcing him to drop to one knee. The move was efficient, calculated, a demonstration of skill rather than brute force. Razor gasped in shock, his eyes widening as he realized he was completely overpowered. The bikers, who had been laughing and jeering moments earlier, suddenly fell silent. They exchanged uneasy glances, unsure of what to do. One of them revved his motorcycle engine loudly, as if trying to regain control of the situation. Another shouted, "Let him go." But their voices lacked conviction. Something about James's presence commanded respect, even fear. James ignored the shouts and kept his attention on Razor. Leaning down slightly, he repeated his earlier command, his voice low but clear. "Pick it up." This time, there was no room for negotiation. Razor hesitated for a fraction of a second before nodding reluctantly. With James still holding his wrist, he reached out awkwardly and began gathering the scattered medals and insignias from the ground. Each movement was slow and deliberate, his usual arrogance replaced by humiliation. As Razor worked, James straightened up, scanning the rest of the gang with a piercing gaze. "Anyone else want to try?" he asked, his tone deceptively casual. The question hung in the air, daring them to make a move. But none of them did. Instead, they shifted uncomfortably, avoiding eye contact. Some even took a step back, putting distance between themselves and the man who had just dismantled their leader with ease. The crowd, which had been holding its collective breath, erupted into murmurs of astonishment. Parents whispered to their children, pointing at James with admiration. Tourists scrambled to capture the scene on their phones, realizing they were witnessing something extraordinary. Even the police officers nearby, who had initially tried to intervene but backed off when the situation escalated, looked on with newfound respect. For James, however, the moment wasn't about glory or recognition. It was about restoring order and protecting what mattered. As Razor finished picking up the last of the items and stood shakily, James released his grip. Without another word, he turned and walked back to his original position near the palace gates, resuming his stoic stance as if nothing had happened. His uniform was immaculate, his posture perfect, and his expression unreadable. Razor stared after him, rubbing his sore wrist and struggling to process what had just occurred. He had come here looking for trouble, expecting an easy target. Instead, he had encountered someone far beyond his understanding, a man whose strength wasn't defined by aggression, but by discipline and resolve. For the first time in a long time, Razor felt truly small. The gang lingered for a few moments longer, their earlier bravado shattered. When one of them muttered, "Let's get out of here," the others didn't argue. Slowly, they mounted their bikes and drove away, their engines quieter than before. The square gradually returned to its normal rhythm, though the memory of what had transpired lingered in the minds of everyone present. As James resumed his post, standing tall and immovable once again, he allowed himself a brief moment of reflection. Breaking protocol had been necessary, but it hadn't been done lightly. Every action he took was guided by a sense of duty, to protect, to serve, and to uphold the values he believed in. And while the encounter might fade into the background of daily life, its impact would remain, a reminder that true strength lies not in causing chaos, but in restoring peace. The crowd erupted into cheers, unable to contain their amazement. Parents clapped enthusiastically, while children stared wide-eyed, as if witnessing a superhero in action. Tourists snapped photos and videos, capturing every moment of the unexpected showdown. Even the police officers nearby couldn't help but exchange impressed glances, their earlier attempts to intervene now rendered unnecessary. For Razor, the reality of the situation finally sank in. He watched as his gang members lay defeated on the cobblestones, their bravado crushed beneath James's calm efficiency. There was no denying it anymore. This wasn't just some ordinary royal guard. This was someone who operated on an entirely different level, someone who could dismantle them all without breaking a sweat. Realization dawned on the remaining bikers too. One by one, they backed away, their earlier arrogance replaced by fear and respect. Some mounted their bikes and sped off, unwilling to risk further humiliation. Others lingered briefly, casting wary glances at James before following suit. Within minutes, the once menacing group had dispersed, leaving only silence in their wake. Razor stood alone now, His shoulders slumped and his head bowed. The weight of defeat pressed heavily on him, and for the first time, he felt truly powerless. When he finally looked up at James, there was no anger in his gaze, only resignation. "Who are you?" he muttered, his voice barely audible over the hum of the dispersing crowd. James didn't answer. He simply adjusted his posture, resuming his stoic stance near the palace gates as if nothing extraordinary had happened. To him, this wasn't about proving a point or seeking recognition. It was about doing what needed to be done, restoring order, protecting tradition, and standing firm in the face of adversity. And while the encounter might fade into memory for others, its impact would linger, serving as a reminder of the quiet strength that lies within those who choose to serve. As the square gradually returned to its usual rhythm, the crowd continued to buzz with excitement. Strangers exchanged stories, recounting every detail of the incredible scene they had just witnessed. For many, it was a lesson in humility and respect, a testament to the idea that true power isn't about causing chaos, but about restoring peace. And for James, it was simply another day of duty, carried out with the same unwavering resolve that defined his life. The aftermath of the confrontation left the square in a state of quiet awe. Razor, now standing alone and defeated, looked around at the remnants of his gang. Most had fled, their motorcycles roaring into the distance as they escaped the scene of their humiliation. The few who remained were helping their injured comrades to their feet, their earlier bravado replaced by shame and discomfort. Razor himself seemed smaller somehow, his imposing frame diminished by the weight of what had just transpired. James stood tall, resuming his position near the palace gates as if nothing out of the ordinary had occurred. His uniform was still immaculate, his posture unwavering, and his expression calm. To the onlookers, it was almost surreal. How could someone so unassuming possess such extraordinary skill? Yet there he was, a living testament to discipline, strength, and resolve. For James, this wasn't about glory or recognition. It was simply another moment of duty fulfilled. As the police officers finally stepped forward to take control of the situation, the crowd began to disperse slowly. Parents ushered their children away, whispering words of admiration for the quiet hero in the red coat. Tourists lingered a little longer, snapping final photos and videos before moving on. Some even approached James cautiously, offering timid thanks or praise. But James didn't acknowledge them. He remained focused, his gaze fixed ahead, embodying the dignity and restraint expected of a royal guard. Razor, however, couldn't bring himself to leave, not yet. Still holding his bruised wrist, he shuffled closer to James, his steps hesitant and uncertain. When he spoke, his voice lacked its earlier aggression. Instead, it carried a tone of reluctant respect. I didn't know," he muttered, his words trailing off awkwardly. James turned his head slightly, meeting Razor's gaze with an unreadable expression. "Didn't know what?" he asked, his voice steady but not unkind. "That you were, you know." Razor gestured vaguely, struggling to find the right words. "Like that. A fighter. Someone who could handle us." James studied him for a moment before responding. "It doesn't matter who I am," he said quietly. "What matters is how you choose to act. Respect isn't given because of fear. It's earned through behavior." Razor nodded slowly, absorbing the words. For all his bluster and bravado, he wasn't entirely irredeemable. Beneath the tough exterior lay a man capable of learning, even if it took a humbling experience like this to teach him. As the police led him and his remaining gang members away, Razor glanced back one last time at James. There was no malice in his eyes, only a flicker of understanding, and perhaps gratitude for the lesson he'd received. By the time the authorities had cleared the area, the square had returned to its usual tranquility. The ceremonial stand that had been knocked over earlier was restored to its proper place, the scattered medals carefully gathered and arranged once more. Life outside Buckingham Palace resumed its predictable rhythm, but the memory of what had happened would linger long after the day ended. For the crowd that had witnessed the events unfold, the story became an instant topic of conversation. Social media buzzed with posts and videos capturing snippets of the encounter. Comments ranged from admiration for James's composure to disbelief at the biker's audacity. One video, showing James effortlessly subduing multiple attackers, quickly went viral, earning thousands of views within hours. Viewers marveled at his precision and calmness, speculating about his background and training. Some joked that James must have been part of a secret elite force, while others insisted he was simply the coolest guy alive. News outlets picked up the story, dubbing James the guardian of tradition. Reporters flocked to the palace, hoping to interview him or learn more about his past. But James remained elusive, refusing to engage with the media or seek any form of recognition. When questioned by his superiors about the incident, he offered a simple explanation. "I did my duty. Nothing more, nothing less." Despite his reluctance to step into the spotlight, the public's fascination with James only grew. Parents began pointing him out to their children as an example of courage and discipline. Teachers referenced his actions in classrooms, using the story to illustrate the importance of respect and responsibility. Even tourists visiting London made it a point to see the hero guard during the changing of the guard ceremony, hoping to catch a glimpse of the man behind the legend. For James, life continued much as it had before. He reported for duty each day, standing watch over the palace with the same dedication and focus that had defined his career. Though strangers often stopped to thank him or ask for photographs, he politely declined, preferring to remain anonymous. Fame held no appeal for him. His satisfaction came from knowing he had done the right thing, regardless of attention or accolades. Still, the incident left a lasting impression on him. In the quiet moments when the square was empty and the world felt still, James allowed himself to reflect on what had happened. He thought about the bikers, their recklessness, their misplaced bravado, and ultimately, their vulnerability. They weren't inherently bad people, just misguided individuals who had never learned the value of respect. Perhaps in some small way, his actions had planted a seed of change in them. More than anything, the encounter reinforced James's belief in the power of discipline and patience. It reminded him that true strength wasn't about dominating others, but about protecting what mattered most. Whether it was safeguarding the traditions of Buckingham Palace or standing up against those who sought to disrupt peace, James knew his role was clear: to serve with honor and integrity, no matter the circumstances. As the sun set over London, casting golden light across the square, James stood tall once again. To the world, he was a symbol of resilience and quiet heroism. To himself, he was simply a man doing his job, a guardian of tradition, a protector of values, and a reminder that sometimes the greatest battles are fought not with weapons, but with character. In the days that followed the confrontation at Buckingham Palace, James Callahan's life remained largely unchanged, at least on the surface. He continued his duties as a royal guard with the same quiet dedication that had always defined him. Each morning, he donned his uniform, adjusted his bearskin hat, and took his place outside the palace gates, standing tall and immovable. To the tourists snapping photos and the locals passing by, he was the same stoic figure they had grown accustomed to seeing, a symbol of tradition and discipline. But beneath this calm exterior, James couldn't help but notice the ripple effects of what had happened. The viral videos and news stories about the guardian of tradition had spread far beyond London, reaching audiences across the globe. Social media platforms buzzed with admiration for his actions, and hashtags like #RespectTheGuard and #Quiethero began trending worldwide. People from all walks of life weighed in, sharing their thoughts on the incident. Some praised James's restraint and skill, while others debated whether the bikers deserved harsher consequences. Regardless of opinion, one thing was clear: James had become an unexpected cultural icon. Despite the growing attention, James remained steadfast in his decision to avoid the spotlight. When reporters camped outside the palace hoping for an interview, he politely declined through official channels. When fans approached him during his shifts, asking for autographs or selfies, he offered a polite smile and shook his head. "I'm just doing my job," he would say softly before returning to his post. His humility only added to the public's admiration, reinforcing the idea that true heroes don't seek recognition. They simply act when called upon. Even within the ranks of the Royal Guards, James's colleagues couldn't resist teasing him lightly about his newfound fame. "You're practically a celebrity now," one of them joked during a break. Another chimed in, "Next thing you know, they'll be making the movie about you." James chuckled along with them, but quickly changed the subject, steering the conversation back to work-related matters. Fame held no allure for him. His focus remained on fulfilling his responsibilities with the same precision and commitment he always had. What did intrigue James, however, were the subtle changes he noticed among the people around him. Parents visiting the palace with their children often used him as an example of good behavior. "See that man over there?" a mother might say, pointing discreetly at James. "He stood up for what was right, even when it was hard. That's the kind of person we should strive to be." Teachers brought students on field trips to the palace, using the story of the bikers' harassment as a lesson in respect, courage, and accountability. Even strangers struck up conversations with James, not to congratulate him, but to express gratitude for reminding them of the importance of standing firm in the face of adversity. These interactions touched James more deeply than he cared to admit. While he didn't crave praise, hearing how his actions had inspired others gave him a renewed sense of purpose. It wasn't just about protecting the palace anymore. It was about embodying the values it represented. Every time someone thanked him or shared how his story had impacted them, James felt a quiet pride, knowing that his choices had made a difference, however small. Yet, despite the positive response, James also understood the fleeting nature of fame. He knew that eventually, the world's attention would shift elsewhere, as it always did. News cycles moved quickly, and soon enough, another story would capture the public's imagination. For James, this was perfectly fine. He had never sought validation from others. His satisfaction came from staying true to himself and his principles. If anything, the temporary spotlight reinforced his belief in leading by example rather than words. As the weeks passed, the initial frenzy surrounding the incident began to die down. Reporters stopped lingering outside the palace, and the flood of social media posts slowed to a trickle. Life returned to its predictable rhythm, both for James and for those who worked alongside him. Yet the legacy of that autumn afternoon lingered in quieter ways. Tour guides leading groups around Buckingham Palace included the story in their presentations, ensuring that future generations would remember the day a single royal guard stood against chaos and restored order. Souvenir shops near the palace even started selling miniature bearskin hats labeled "Guardian of Tradition," much to James's bemusement. For Razor and his gang, the consequences of their actions played out differently. Arrested and charged with disorderly conduct, vandalism, and harassment, they faced legal repercussions that forced them to confront the seriousness of their behavior. During court proceedings, Razor admitted that the encounter with James had been a wake-up call. "I thought I was untouchable," he confessed. "But that guy, he showed me what real strength looks like. Not brute force, but control. Respect." Though Razor's words hinted at personal growth, James preferred not to dwell on the outcome. To him, the biker's redemption, or lack thereof, wasn't his responsibility. What mattered was that he had acted according to his values, setting an example for anyone watching. Whether the bikers learned from their mistakes was ultimately up to them. In quieter moments, James reflected on the broader significance of the incident. It reminded him that every action, no matter how small, carried weight. Standing still amidst chaos wasn't weakness. It was resilience. Breaking protocol to defend honor wasn't defiance. It was leadership. And choosing peace over aggression wasn't cowardice. It was wisdom. These lessons weren't new to James, but the events of that day had crystallized them in ways he hadn't anticipated. As he stood guard once again under the pale autumn sky, James allowed himself a rare moment of introspection. He thought about the path that had led him here, from his days as a Navy SEAL to his current role as a Royal Guard, and realized that his journey had always been about service. Whether protecting his country on distant battlefields or safeguarding tradition outside Buckingham Palace, his mission remained the same: to uphold values greater than himself. And so James continued his watch, unwavering and resolute. To the world, he was a hero, a guardian, a symbol of quiet strength. To himself, he was simply a man doing his duty, one steadfast step at a time. The legacy of that crisp autumn afternoon at Buckingham Palace lingered long after the initial buzz had faded. For James Callahan, life returned to its predictable rhythm, but the impact of his actions rippled outward in ways he could never have anticipated. The story of the quiet royal guard who stood firm against chaos became more than just a fleeting moment of heroism. It evolved into a timeless reminder of discipline, respect, and the power of leading by example. Tourists visiting London began including the Palace Square on their itineraries, not just for its historical significance, but also to catch a glimpse of the man behind the legend. Some even brought their children specifically to point out James during the changing of the guard ceremony. "See him," parents would whisper, gesturing toward the tall figure in the red coat and bearskin hat. "That's the man who taught us that true strength isn't about fighting. It's about staying calm and doing what's right." These small moments of recognition didn't faze James. If anything, they reinforced his belief in the importance of setting an example through action rather than words. Teachers across the globe incorporated the story into their lessons, using it as a tool to teach values like patience, courage, and accountability. In classrooms from New York to Tokyo, students learned about how one person's unwavering commitment to duty could inspire change. Essays were written, debates were held, and projects were created, all centered around the idea that even the quietest heroes can leave the loudest impact. For many young minds, James became a symbol of resilience, proof that standing up for what is right doesn't always require grand gestures, but often simply the willingness to hold your ground. Meanwhile, Razor and his gang faced the consequences of their actions. Legal proceedings dragged on for months, with each court appearance serving as a public reckoning for their behavior. Razor, once brash and unapologetic, emerged from the ordeal a changed man. During one hearing, he addressed the judge with unexpected sincerity. "I used to think being tough meant causing trouble," he admitted. "But now I know real toughness is about control, about knowing when to stop and respecting others." That day outside the palace, it changed me. Though James never sought to hear about Razor's transformation, news of it eventually reached him through colleagues who kept tabs on the case. While he felt no personal satisfaction in the outcome, he couldn't deny that the incident had sparked something meaningful, not just for himself or the bikers, but for everyone involved. It was a reminder that even in moments of conflict, there is always room for growth and understanding. Back at Buckingham Palace, the ceremonial stand that had been knocked over during the confrontation became a subtle symbol of renewal. Restored to its proper place, it stood as a testament to resilience and tradition. Onlookers passing by might not have known its full story, but those familiar with the events of that day saw it as a marker of triumph, a reminder that respect and order could prevail over disruption. For James, the aftermath of the incident deepened his appreciation for the role he played. Though he had initially chosen the position of a royal guard as a way to step away from the high-stakes world of military service, he now realized that his work carried its own kind of weight. Protecting the palace wasn't just about guarding a building. It was about preserving the values it represented, values of honor, dignity, and steadfastness. Every hour spent standing watch was a reaffirmation of his purpose, a quiet declaration that some things were worth defending no matter the cost. As weeks turned into months, James found comfort in the routine of his duties. The crowds came and went, the seasons shifted, and the world continued spinning forward. Yet, every so often, someone would approach him. a stranger, a tourist, or even a fellow Londoner, and thank him for inspiring them. Some shared stories of how his actions had encouraged them to stand up for themselves or others. Others simply expressed gratitude for reminding them of the importance of respect and humility. Each interaction, though brief, left James with a renewed sense of fulfillment. In quieter moments, James reflected on the broader meaning of what had happened. He thought about the delicate balance between tradition and modernity, between order and chaos. Life, he realized, was full of disruptions, moments that tested our resolve and forced us to choose between reacting impulsively or responding thoughtfully. His decision to act that day hadn't been about seeking glory or proving a point. It had been about honoring the principles he believed in, even when it meant stepping outside his usual boundaries. Ultimately, James understood that his story wasn't just about him. It was about the collective human experience, the shared desire to find meaning in our actions and to make choices that reflect our best selves. Whether it was a parent teaching their child about respect, a teacher using his story to inspire students, or a former biker learning the value of humility, the ripple effects of that single afternoon stretched far beyond what anyone could have imagined. And so, James continued his watch, standing tall and immovable as the world moved around him. To the tourists snapping photos, he was a symbol of history and tradition. To the locals walking past, he was a familiar presence, a constant in an ever-changing city. But to those who truly understood his story, he was something more, a quiet guardian, a steadfast protector, and a living reminder that sometimes the greatest acts of heroism are the ones we don't see coming. In the end, James's legacy wasn't defined by fame or recognition. It was defined by the quiet strength he embodied every day, a strength that reminded everyone fortunate enough to witness it that true heroes aren't born, they're made, one steadfast choice at a time.